One of the commonalities that I think has come up throughout the day has been the importance of people. And as we know as business leaders globally, the importance of talent in terms of driving competitive advantage is one of these long-term mega trends, as our first speaker said. And it's also something that potentially plays to the strength of Europe, right? So with our humanist values and that. And so that's where we want to take a little detour now and discuss some of the work at INSEAD on global talent. As you may know, INSEAD has had a long-standing leading index on the Global Innovation Index. We have a really leading index on how innovative countries are. And that's headed by our next speaker, Bruno Lanvin. But a couple years ago, spurred in part by the work we were doing on European competitiveness, we decided to launch a new index focusing in particular on not the innovation side, but the talent side of country competitiveness. So please join me in welcoming Bruno to talk about that initiative. Bruno, please come on down.
Thank you, Peter. So this is the last stretch. Okay? You have had your break, you had your caffeine. Now you have to survive until the end of the day. And I'm going to say a few words about our Global Talent Competitiveness Index. As Peter said, this was launched now 3 years ago. We released the latest edition in Davos in January, and we are now getting ready with the next edition, which will be launched again in Davos at the end of January. So what I'm going to describe now is some of the main results. I will explain the methodology, what we try to do, and how it applies to Europe, and what could be some of the main lessons we can draw from the data we are collecting and from the analysis we've been carrying out. This is called an index, and it's a very crowded field out there. There are almost as many economic indices as there are rankings for business schools. And they're all competing with each other, and everybody is looking for the mother of all indices that will tell us what the truth is. An index, what is an index? Well, we can think of it as a finger. This is the index. And we've heard a few Chinese saying already. And the good thing with Chinese saying is that there's one that applies to practically every single situation we can think of. And if there is none, you can always invent one and nobody can check. So but there's one which is apparently a real one, which says that when the wise man shows the moon, the fool looks at the finger. Okay? And this is how indices can be misleading. The reason why INSEAD is involved in indices is not to produce another academic report or another index, is to produce a tool for action. So what matters is the moon. It's where do we want to go? How can we help decision makers, whether they are in the public sector or in the private sector, to make better decisions? How can a country become a better innovator? How can a talent policy be better articulated? This is the moon. And the index is just an instrument to show where we might want to head. So let's keep that in mind, and let's keep a critical eye about what an index is. Now, if we can go to the first slide, because I do have slides. That's the title page. So it's a real report. We like to kill trees from time to time, so it's a 400-page report. But it's available online for free. Okay, so we don't have to kill that many trees. And I will say a few words about what this index contains and what we might think it could do for the identifying what works in Europe. So next slide. I have a clicker, I think. Yeah, the clicker is not voice activated. How do I get rid of this? Thank you. No need to get into the detail of this slide, but there's an important message here, which is that this is a joint effort. Okay? So we have supporters from both the public and the private sector, sponsors, and this year it includes the HCLI, Human Capital Leadership Institute in Singapore, and ADECO. And if you look at the right of ADECO, what do you see? You see a little blank space. There's room for one more sponsor. Okay? So please keep that in mind. We are always interested in joining forces. But again, the reason why these companies are there is not because they want to create their own little school of thought, etc. It's because they believe that this is something that is going to help them, whether it is on the public or on the private side. And we have, of course, a prestigious advisory board who is not just, blue ribbon type of organization. These are people who give feedback, criticize, express unhappiness or happiness from time to time. But basically, they keep us within the range of what is useful for decision making in the area of talent competitiveness. This is the model, because the whole thing relies on a model. And mention has been made about the fashion industry earlier this morning. And with my own family name, I can't escape thinking it's a great industry. But there's a difference between fashion and economics, which is that in economics, models generally are not very sexy. So here is the unsexy model of GTCI. Basically, and I'm not getting into details, you have a left side and a right side. And in terms, we called it input and output. And this is really, I would say, over-designating it. Because when you deal with talent, practically everything you can think is on the side of input could also be considered as part of output. Think, for instance, of the number of people of your nationality who would go abroad to study. Is this an input or is it an output? It's clearly both. Because they may go out because you don't have enough good schools and universities at home to train them. Therefore, it's an output of your lack of education infrastructure. But it's also an input because hopefully they will come back with more knowledge and talent. So all that is disputable. And what we have is actually a basis which is a working basis. And I'm not getting into the rationale of each of those. I will just insist on two important elements. The first one is that a number of elements are not specific to talent, especially if you look at the enabler side of things. We look at the regulatory landscape, the ease of doing business, the existence of labor legislations, whether they are fragmented or not, for instance. So a number of elements there you will find also in our other indices, and Peter mentioned the Innovation Index. These remain critically important. They are the macro level against which any talent policy or strategies can be developed. If you go to the other end of the model, you will see that in terms of output, we focus on two elements. What we call at the extreme right, the global knowledge skills. Typically what INSEAD teaches. Okay? The ability to lead multicultural teams, the ability to think across borders, to think strategically and longer term. This is what we call the GK skills. But with equal importance, what we call the LV, which is largely vocational skills. And we heard, including in the previous session from Peter, the importance of apprenticeship. Okay? This we discover, and I'm going to say a few words later on this, is critically important to determine the talent performance of national economies. Typically, this is what you find inside the report. We have country tables. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of that. I'm not going to explain why we picked Croatia. I don't know. It was a nice European example, a small country. But it gives you an idea of what you can find in there, which is the key indicators on the various pillars and sub-pillars of the model, and a visual way to actually immediately say, well, this country seems to be doing better than that other country. And by the way, doing better than another country never works more efficiently than at a local level. I promise not to pick on any country, but let's say that when I present this index in Belgium, for instance, which happened not so long ago, of course, they're interested in knowing whether Belgium is doing better than Brazil or China. But what is really, really interesting is knowing whether they're doing better than the Dutch, okay, or Luxembourg or the French. And we play a lot on that. That is local emulation, regional competition clearly is part of the reason for the success of these indices. So 65 variables, 100 93 countries. Next year will be 109. So it's fairly reasonable in terms of coverage of data and countries. Now, what do we get out of that? What we get is the ranking. And there we have a very schizophrenic presentation of the ranking, because we know that this is what makes the headlines. We know that this is why every time this report is published, there's something like 450 articles in major media, etc. And the first thing you see is the top ranking. And we said this is the tip of the iceberg. This is the finger. What you should be interested in is the moon. Where do you want to go? What do you make out of that? And action does not lie there. This may be important to catch the attention of policymakers, maybe of strategic thinkers in some circles, but where you can make a difference is at the pillar and sub-pillar level. So this is why we try to identify key messages, starting with the top level, the rankings, and going there to the pillar and sub-pillar level. And what the key messages from last year included the following. Openness is important. That is, if we look at this list of the top 10 or the top 20, a large majority can claim openness. Okay? Some didn't have the choice. Some were little enclaved countries. Switzerland, for instance, at the very top. Switzerland has hardly any choice to be an open economy. Some were by choices, some were by history. Think of Australia, for instance. Okay? So this idea that openness is a critical element includes various types of rationale, but it is the highest degree of correlation. When we want to see who is most successful in terms of talent, we find that open economies are. By the way, this is also valid for innovation. So there's a strong triangular correlation between innovation, talent, and openness of an economy. Second, employable skills are the goal. This is critically important, and I will come back to that in the case of Europe, because we see a number of countries, some are ranked in this index, many of them are, who are actually performing fairly high on the scale of education. They're producing a number of people with degrees, including PhDs. But many of these countries produce PhDs in a number of areas where these people can't find a job. As opposed to what we see in countries like Switzerland, like Austria, like Germany, where apprenticeship has been for a long time part of the education process, and this leads to employable skills. So we have a number of elements there that are confirmed by the GTCI analysis. And last but not least, I already mentioned it, clearly it's important to look at the skills of tomorrow, will be needed to produce the innovators, the leaders of global cooperation or open cooperation of tomorrow. But let's not lose sight of the fact that the performing economies also need people who are happy to develop vocational skills and not a dichotomic type of society. This is what we like to do, that is to project everything in 2 dimensions. Real life is 3 dimensions, but that's too complicated for economists. So we try to focus on 2 dimensions. And basically what you have, this is the core diagram, the one which is often the most commented in the report. And without getting into the detail, just to say 2 things. Basically, the line you have there is the correlation line. It's a log-log scale. The spheres, the size of the spheres is an indication of the size of populations. So when you have a big bubble here, so you see, for instance, India, you see China, you see the US at the top. This is a big population bubble. It is important to get a dynamic vision. I can't get any animation on this, but when you see a big bubble like the Chinese one moving up, it tells you that something important is happening. Of course, if Austria or Belgium or Spain are moving up, it's also interesting and important, but it doesn't have the same global consequences as something moving in China or India. And clearly, in the area of talent, lots are happening in China and India and Brazil. This is the same chart for Europe. So again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to comment on this, but we see that there is some kind of discrepancy On one hand of the spectrum, you have the smaller countries, typically Luxembourg, Switzerland there. You have also smaller countries, typically the former Yugoslavian parts of Yugoslavia, Balkan economies, and the bigger bubbles are somehow concentrated in the middle. So there are some lessons we can draw from that about the European dynamics in terms of talent. This is another way of representing it, which shows where Europe is vis-à-vis the world. And this is a key message we need to keep in mind. Europe is doing well. Okay? In terms of talent, Europe is well positioned. That is the center of gravity of the black dots compared to the overall dots in the world is clearly to the right of the diagram. Okay? So let's not do European bashing in that area. Things are pretty good regarding talent. What is doing less well is the continued ability of Europe to attract talent and, more importantly, to retain that talent. So we see a number of very successful entrepreneurs in the US, for instance, who come from European countries and don't necessarily come back. They don't necessarily come back with the benefits of their business creation and with the ability to create more growth and more employment in Europe. That's the flip side of the coin. And this is reflected by this table. Everything which is in colors is non-European. Okay? So we see that in the top 20, the majority is indeed made of European countries. So that's the point I was making before, with small countries at the top and at the very end, and the bigger ones somewhere in the middle. If we look at it worldwide in terms of income group, because if you remember the bubble chart, there's a clear, very strong correlation between talent performance and GDP per capita. In other words, the richer countries are doing better. They have better universities, they have better infrastructure. It's easier to attract and reward talent if you're a rich economy than if you're a poor economy. That's fairly obvious. So we differentiate our analysis by income group. We look at the very rich, those who are in the middle but richer than the average, those who are in the middle but lower than the average, and we look at poor countries. And in each of them, it's interesting to look how the champions are faring, because this might be the champions of tomorrow. They are outperforming their peers at comparable levels of income. And when you see what's happening in Costa Rica or in a country like Guatemala, indeed, there are a number of signs that tell us that something might be happening there that is also worth keeping an eye on. An interesting pattern, if we look at these income groups as well, is that we have talent leaders in each and every one. And if we stretch the definition of Europe to include Armenia, and we can look at it from different angles there, we have an interesting pattern. I'm just putting it as a question there. We have the number one per income group who happens to be a European country, and the number two happens to be an Asian country. And maybe there's a message there that the next pressure in terms of attracting talents might be coming from that particular part of the world. Again, there's not enough data to substantiate that on a bigger sample of countries, but it's something that may be worth considering in terms of international dynamics. So last slide. What are the key messages and how they apply to Europe? And hopefully this will lead us to the panel discussion. And I can go fairly quickly on this because I've mentioned most of it. The first one is openness. Openness seems to work. Those countries who are more open, and it takes a very specific meaning in the current situation in which Europe is vis-à-vis migration right now, openness is a key ingredient to being a successful competitor for talent. Message number two, talent development is not an end in itself. The reason why you want to develop talent is, of course, competitiveness, it's growth, but in Europe, it is very much about fighting unemployment, especially youth unemployment. We still have 54% of unemployment for people below 25 years of age in Spain and in Greece, for instance. Message number three, talent development is going to become non-traditional. And this is something with which many top schools, including INSEAD, are confronted. Clearly, you need some kind of continuous training. You need to rely more on technology. You need to rely more on distance learning, lifelong learning. And again, vocational skills apprenticeship are going to become even more critical in the future. And last but not least, technology is going to change all of that. It used to be common sense to think that technology would threaten the jobs which were repetitive, boring, could be mechanized. We see now a totally different landscape shaping up where knowledge skills can be replaced by machines. Lawyers, bankers, a number of professions, architects are being replaced to a large extent for a large part of the skills they have to develop by technology. And this technology happens to be global. So in terms of mobility of talents and where the needs will be, the critical needs will be in the future, this remains an open question, but one on which companies and governments want to keep an eye. So that's the few elements about GTCI. Thank you.
Stay here. Very good.